Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, over the past decade, U.S. military ships, planes, and equipment have quote unquote mysteriously failed when confronted by both Russian and Chinese opposition. And it appears as maybe continuing reality following the two crashes within 30 minutes of each other of two U.S. aircraft in the South China Sea.
Yeah, and we have to ask the question, and we're going to unearth a ton of evidence to support asking this question. Is China behind all these US military incidents in the South China Sea? And it's not an unreasonable question to ask because Can's been very busy digging out all the previous incidents or a number of them to highlight why there is supporting evidence to believe that this is the case. But what I'll mention first is that there was confirmation Monday this week by the US Pacific Fleet that two of its military aircraft, as Ken said, crashed apparently within less than an hour in the South China Sea. There are investigations underway. Of course, there are going to be an opportunity for China to make claims that this is to do with declining operational capabilities of the US Navy, the US Air Force, etc., etc. But what is absolutely true is the US military has a record of accidents in inverted commas in the South China Sea in recent years. But obviously, if you look at the fact that there was a US military helicopter and a fighter jet crashing in the South China Sea within 30 minutes of each other, you have to ask some serious questions as to what's going on. And then, of course, Trump made the claim, well, the statements to do with bad fuel or something. What, I mean, that's a bit of an odd statement to make. I mean, bad fuel, what does that even mean? So then that kind of probably one of those situations where he should have obviously not said anything at all. One thing we do know is that there was obviously the Chinese came out and said that the US aircraft crashed while conducting military drills in the South China Sea, and the US continues to try and flex its muscles by sending military vessels and aircraft to that region and saying this is the root cause of security issues at sea and disruption to regional peace and stability. Well, okay, China's going to make that statement clearly. But what I'll do now is pass you over to Ken because he's got a whole bunch of incidents that have happened. And I think that there's a very compelling argument to suggest that some of these accidents or all of these accidents are not necessarily accidents at all.
Yeah, go back to 2017. And that was, I believe, the year that we had the issue with the destroyer, the USS Donald Cook. Now, this was in the Black Sea rather than the South China Sea. But immediately after, all power was killed off from that. Allegedly, the story goes, is that two Russian aircraft hovered directly over the USS Donald Cook, and instantaneously they neutralized the ship's systems and radar. And there came a story in a mainstream British publication that the Russian media now, its military is capable of neutralizing U.S. warships with electronic jamming devices. This was back in 2017. Move forward a little bit to what has occurred, of course, in China. Um, a publication known as Interesting Engineering, and this was in 2024. China claims new radar penetrated the toughest U.S. jamming jet in the South China Sea. This was followed by, within a week, where one of the United States' major military aircraft companies, their electronic warfighter runs into China's quote unquote kill web in the South China Sea, where the Chinese military's radar system pretty much beats all U.S. fighter jets. And interestingly enough, one of the two aircraft that crashed a couple days ago in the South China Sea was from this same aircraft manufacturer. You can guess pretty much what it is when I say an F-18. Now, there was another incident back in 2021. A nuclear powered submarine, the USS Connecticut, had an accident. Allegedly, power shut off and it ran aground just off the coast of mainland China. So you start seeing a number of these different incidents. There was also an incident that wasn't widely publicized, but it may have in some circles. A U.S. Warship was off the coast of Japan and lost power completely and ran into a Japanese trawler. So over the past decade, if not, yeah, less than a decade, you see a number of different incidents where U.S. warships, U.S. aircraft are suddenly losing power as if they were hit by an EMP or if there was jamming that was able to break through their E3 defenses and shut off their power.
Yeah, and I would add there was another incident, or incident back in, sorry, January, I think, of 2022. I remember seeing that it was where there was an F-35, obviously fighter jet. It had this landing or totally failed landing on the deck of the USS Carl Vinson, which is an aircraft carrier, and it crashed in the South China Sea. So again, you can argue, well, that's an accident. These things happen. But then, of course, if you go back to, I think as well, December 2024, there was actually, you've already referred to that, Ken, sorry. So these kind of incidents, when we look at them, are clearly a litany of problems associated with the US Navy, with obviously the US Air Force, and obviously the one thing the United States is not would like to not have on record is that there was electronic warfare or misadventure at play, because it would be a hammer blow to the military prowess, which we're one of the channels who's repeatedly said the US military prowess is just a myth, but it's one thing having it definitively proved. So people will turn around and say, well, why has the US not come out and attacked the Chinese about this? Well, if we assume that in fact it's true and the Chinese, for argument's sake, were responsible, the US is never going to admit this. Not when there's been this catalogue of incidents that have happened in recent years. Because, as I say, every aircraft that's involved, every aircraft carrier that's involved, or nuclear power submarine, or anything else, it raises a serious question about the entire spectrum of the US's military capabilities and what could have amount to not an accident in the South China Sea, but in fact something that is a nefarious incident that arguably could be at the hands of the Chinese. It might not be the Chinese, but there's certainly, if you were going to pick on someone to be responsible, it's more likely to be them than anyone else. And of course, the response from the Chinese is going to be, whether one way or the other, well, we'll provide humanitarian assistance if possible with regards to this incident, because they're not going to come out and go, well, actually, we were responsible for this, for very obvious reasons as well. But I think there's been too many of these incidents happening, and you have to start to question whether this is just the fact that the US military hardware is useless, or there is something far more nefarious at play. And of course, one can argue that the timing of this is interesting, particularly given this ongoing discussions between the Chinese and the United States about the whole trade war, tariff war, sanctions, etc., culminating in, well, It's not being confirmed by the Chinese yet, but Xi and Trump are supposed to hold a meeting in South Korea on Thursday. Well, maybe that's just a little warning shot across the bows for the United States potentially, because at the end of the day, one of the major topics that will be under discussion, apart from the trade war, tariff war, is going to be Taiwan, is going to be the South China Sea, and also relates to the sort of technology and whether it's civilian technology or military technology, and the fact that obviously there has been attempts now by the United States first to try and restrict China's capabilities in new technologies, but semiconductors being an obvious one with Huawei. And China's response was to go for rare earths because they know that will cause enormous damage to the US's military capabilities on the basis of just manufacturing and producing weapons and military hardware, including, of course, fighter jets, nuclear submarines, or anything else for that matter that's in their arsenal of weapons across the whole spectrum of the US military.
We also have to take into consideration a combination of other factors. Primarily, if you look at the United States over the past decade to 2 decades, their scorecard in conflicts has been absolutely atrocious. Whether it's spending 20 years in 17 to 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan and running out like it was Saigon 2.0, going with their military against the Houthis and failing to subdue their capacity to launch missiles into Gaza and Israel. The hit and run, that's what I call what the United States did with Iran, is a hit and run job. They couldn't actually go in and do anything of substance. It was simply a hit and run job. Then, of course, there was the attempt to create a $300 million pontoon bridge to bring supplies into Gaza that just scuttled itself within the waters. So the United States has had the other thing I was going to add is when the U.S. tried to gear up its arms manufacturing to supply for Ukraine, what the arms manufacturers discovered is that the older munitions, they no longer had engineers who knew how to put it together. So they had to scramble to try to get engineers out of retirement to be able to train the new people on how to build these old armaments. Then, of course, you'd have to take a look at what's going on right now. The government shutdown. They can't even pay their military. And before President Trump got into office, the military was overweight, chock full of DEI, and probably didn't have the capacity to attack Florida, much less anybody else. So you see that everything as a whole, especially with what President Trump has been trying to portray. We're the greatest military in the world. We've got the greatest aircraft, the greatest subs, the greatest nukes, the greatest everything. He's trying to portray that to the world. And the world looks at the fruit of the U.S. military across the board for the past 2 decades, and they're not very impressed.
Yeah, exactly. And just to go back to the point, I mean, I think it's very bizarre that Trump comes out and says bad fuel was believed to be the reason the two aircraft went down, because no one surely would have said that to him. And especially when they're saying in the next breath, well, oh, we're still under investigation to try and ascertain, exactly what occurred with these two incidents. But I think it's very interesting as well. These two aircraft ended up in the sea, just as Trump arrived in Malaysia at the start of this Asian tour. I mean, is that a coincidence? Well, it could be a coincidence, but maybe it isn't. And it could be part of this long, sort of prolonged kind of problem where the United States is trying to stoke tensions in the South China Sea. And China is obviously extremely angry with the fact that they've now tried to rope in the Philippines to carry out all these naval exercises. They're trying to assert sovereignty over all these disputed islands and reefs in the contested Spratly Islands. So, is this an attempt by potentially by the Chinese to just warn the United States to get out of the South China Sea because these incidents will keep happening, and we're doing it, we know we're doing it, but neither of us has any reason to admit to it, most of all the United States, because if they had to own up to the fact that China was using jamming technology to cause all kind of mayhem to US military hardware, whether it's planes, planes, ships, nuclear submarines, etc. That is just too much for the US to have to bear, to actually have to admit that, because that would be effectively saying we are indeed sitting ducks and our military technology is useless, even though, as we've said on many occasions, that is the truth anyway.
I think the most important thing to recognize here is that there has been enough evidence that either Russia or China has been involved in these type of incidents over the past decade. But we can't assume that every single incident is a uh, adversarial attack on the United States and the United States military. But what is really the bottom line is that the whole thing has become so gray that it's really difficult, especially when you look at the politics of it. As you mentioned, with Trump coming to Southeast Asia and to see Xi on Thursday, this is similar in ways to what came out of Alaska when Putin went, gave Trump the business, laid out everything, and Trump was looking like he was hit squarely between the eyes with reality. And there's a very good chance that this might be one of those instances. We'll find out here in the future. Any further comments you wanted to add to this, Paul?
No, I think that's a good point to stop. I think the only small point I'd make is I think there's enough evidence here over a number of years to raise the serious question. As we said, is China responsible for these incidents that are happening with US military hardware in the South China Sea?
Very well said. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.